Welcome, everyone. We are doing a Saturday show, so that's why you're all here. We got a nice group here. Looks like about as many as we've had on Friday night shows. So we're happy to hear that. We always start with prayer, a Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, we're going to start right out the gate. Larry, you're going to give us a little bit of a primer on subtitle C versus subtitle A.
Well, primers are always helpful, especially with the way the income tax laws are structured. So every time, in my view, the story of the income tax gets repeated, it results in pounding it more into people's heads. And that's one of the reasons why I like to constantly repeat, even though it's maybe kind of old, saying it again often helps a student to learn how the thing is structured. Now, in 1926, the federal laws were scattered everywhere. They were in the statutes at large. And the only organization of the United States laws at that time was by the revised statutes. So there's this guy by the name of Colonel Little, been working in the war, had been a colonel in the war. He was in Congress. He said, we need to get the laws organized, the federal laws. Now, a lot of people don't know what a codification is, a code. Codes have been around in the law for a long time. You know, here in Alabama, Alabama was a member of the Union. We joined the United States in 1820. By 1840, and Alabama was a small state at that time, our legislature produced the first code. Now, what is a code? A code is when laws are originally published, they're enacted by a legislature, they're published in books. And those books contain the real laws. They're just one law published right after another. But finding the law is kind of difficult. You got to be an expert. You got to really study it and know where things are. Otherwise, you end up searching through a lot of books. So long ago, back in the 19th century, the 1800s, states started, quote, codifying the law. Now, what is a codification? A codification is dividing the existing, current, pending, valid law up into subject matter categories. The first time that this happened at the federal level was in 1873. Now, if you go over to my website, here's my website, Beecraft Briefs, that's one search term, or Dixieland Law Journal. Yeah, Joe, let's go over there so people can take a look at the codifications. Now, it may be federal jurisdiction or go on down a little bit further. Yeah, take a look at federal jurisdiction. But somewhere on my website, and I didn't look at it before we started this program, you can look around on my website, and one of these links right here, you can go over to an explanation of the United States Code. But in 1873, what Congress did is they passed a law. We're going to create 35 titles of the law. And those titles were going to contain, the existing law in an organized fashion. So we had created in 1873 an organization of the federal laws. Well, by 1928, yeah, they're the current titles. By 1928, Congress said, well, we got a whole bunch of years, 40 years since the last codification. So in 1926, they created the current United States Code. And as you can see, that the code is divided up into these titles. So the existing laws, like on Title 12, all of the existing laws, the ones that are still in effect right now, regarding banks and banking, they're published in Title 12. So when you go over there, you see that it's organized, and it makes finding the law a whole lot easier. Now, in 1926, one of the things that they did is they created the Internal Revenue Code. And the Internal Revenue Code contains all of the tax laws. You go into it, Joe, right. Now, the income tax is in the first part of Title 26. And Title 26 is divided up. You can see these brackets, these groups. You got in Subtitle A, the income tax, Subtitle B, estate and gift, Subtitle C, the employment taxes, Subtitle D, miscellaneous excise taxes, Subtitle E, the booze taxes, and Subtitle F, procedure and administration. So the income tax is all contained from Section 1 of Title 26 all the way up through, I think it's probably about 1561 or thereabouts. That's when you find the end of the income tax. But the income tax is just the substantive provisions. If you want to know how it administratively is enforced, you have to go over to Subtitle F. Now, that is a real short, quick summary of the income tax. Now, the income tax itself is divided up into a series of chapters, and chapter 1 deals with the income tax. Now, the income tax, section 61, deals with income. Now, I know that most patriots are familiar with this issue of income. Well, here is section 61 of Title 26. I'm going to ask Mark to read them. What is Subtitle A? Subsection A, 26C.
Well, that's a general definition, Larry, which means it encompasses everything else except as otherwise provided in this subtitle. I would say that's an exclusionary clause there that we should be looking out for in the future. And then it says gross income means all income from whatever source derived, including but not limited to the following items. And the first one on the list is compensation for services, including fees, commissions, fringe benefits, and similar items such as wages.
Gross income derived from business.
Oops.
Now, is gross income subject to tax?
I misread. There's no wages there, though.
Yeah, yeah. Now, a lot of people want to deal with Section 61 and think, well, everything you want to know about income is encompassed in Section 61. Well, what are people, for people that have never dug into the history of the income tax, they're missing something. And what people are missing is the history of the income tax sections. So how do we dig into this history of Section 61? Well, you can go back to, I think most people that are on this call are joined in this meeting over the internet. They're familiar with in 1894, the United States Supreme Court was called upon to determine the constitutional validity of the 1894 federal income tax. Now, in that 1894 Income Tax Act, you had a definition or a section dealing with income, and the tax was imposed upon income. Now, a lot of people are familiar with the fact that the 1894 income tax was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1894. That necessitated an effort to amend the United States Constitution. So that effort started in 1909, and Congress proposed the 16th Amendment. It was submitted to the states for ratification, and allegedly by 1913, Joe's birthday in 1913, Philander Knox, Secretary of State, said, well, gee, the 16th Amendment of the United States Constitution was ratified. So within less than 10 months after that proclamation, Congress came out with, in October 1913, a federal income tax, the first federal income tax under the 16th Amendment. Now, what we're going to do today is I want to show that there's, a lot of meaning, a lot of understanding, a lot of learning could be obtained by looking at the prior definition of gross income. Now, Joe, You have this section, section 26 USC, section 61. This is found on the internet, right?
Yes.
And our attendees at this meeting tonight, you can go over to just type into an internet search engine, 26 USC section 61, and this will come up. Now, for decades, I have encountered people, students of the income tax, and they all realize, they think, they understand, oh, there is no need to dig into the history of the income tax. I've had leaders of groups, I bring up this issue. Well, what about the history of all this? And too many of them say, well, we don't need to know. That's just something else to learn. We don't need to dig into the history of the income tax. We don't need to dig into the history of the sections in the income tax. Well, let me just tell you, that is an erroneous consumption. There is a lot to be learned by digging into the prior versions of the Internal Revenue Code. Would you agree with that, Joe?
I sure do. I sure do. And you're the one that turned me on to it many, many decades ago. That, I didn't learn it on the CPA exam or at San Jose State University, but nevertheless, you opened my eyes that it needs to be known if you want to know how these laws really work.
Okay, so when you were studying the income tax in school, did you only use the current code?
Yes,
And did you think that Section 61 was the sine qua non of what is income?
absolutely. That's what we were taught. No need to look any further.
And is it generally kind of frowned upon for students of the income tax to dig into the history?
It was frowned upon by me. I got yelled at my first day on the job at the IRS for doing so.
For what were you doing?
I was looking in the Internal Revenue Code. And
Well, what about the
my group
So you were
manager got
looking at the
mad.
current code and not even digging into the history, and you were castigated because of that?
Yeah, he's a former Marine and IRS special agent, group manager, and he got really mad at me for opening up the Internal Revenue Code.
Okay. Well, hey, Joe, let's get off this. Let's go over to my website. And you brought up this document that's on the screen called named the character of income. That is something that we're going to be distributing at the end of this meeting. And one of the things I also want to accomplish this meeting, I would like to lay out about 15 minutes. I've tried several times during these meetings to try to get some, comments from our participants. And I would like to see what our participants want to accomplish, what they think is really important. What do they need to learn? And one of the things, since this is dealing with the income tax, I think it's really important to deal with income. And I've got information on my website about this. So if you go over to my website, it's Dixieland Law Journal. That's a search term. That's the name of the website. Now, when you get over to my website, you can see this is all that's on the front page. And there's a whole lot of material on this website that's related to, there's constitutional issues, federal jurisdiction. To me, that's real important. Economics, that's real important. But then this link here to the taxation page is also very important. And I would invite our attendees to, visit that page because there's a lot of good information there. Now, Joe, click on that link, and there we have what is income. Why don't we click on that link? Now, tonight, I would like to, I know we kind of indicated, maybe hinted at it during previous meetings we've had, but this time I want to really get into, I think there's something to be learned by digging into, what the Supreme Court had to say about income and what the tax acts have said about what is income. So let's get back into, what I mentioned just a minute ago, the 1894 Act. Joe, can you blow up that page? What is it? What is income? Some basics. so that we can get a full screen of the 1894 Act? Oh, that's a lot better. Now, I think it's real important, and it is made available to this group, the old tax acts. Now, you can also look at the old tax acts on my website. Now, I think it's real important for the average student digging into this stuff. I've just seen that, you know, the average public not having any legal training, they just know about some topics like the income tax. You just need to be exposed to it. How do you think lawyers are taught? Well, lawyers are taught by being exposed to various laws and then read them. And those lawyers don't know a blooming thing before they read those laws. But when you read those laws and study them, then you begin to understand them. So for students of the income tax, I think it's real important for people to understand that, gee, there's a history behind all this. If you're talking about the income tax, hey, you need to know something about its history. What is the history of the income tax? Well, it's real simple. The current income tax is found in the 1986 Internal Revenue Code. The 1986 Internal Revenue Code, how was it created? Well, in 1986, Congress took the existing income tax laws, the Internal Revenue Code, which was called the 1954 Internal Revenue Code. All Congress did on that date was simply change the name of the 1954 Internal Revenue Code to the 1986 Internal Revenue Code. So let's go back to the 1954 Code. What is the 1954 Code? Well, at that time, all of the federal tax laws were contained in a book called the 1939 Internal Revenue Code, which had been enacted by Congress in 1939. But in 1939, federal tax laws were just scattered all throughout the United States statutes at large. But as we talked about at the beginning of this program, there's a great benefit by taking laws that are scattered all throughout a jurisdiction's, books that contain all the acts of that legislature and organize them. So in 1939, all the tax laws were just scattered everywhere. You had booze taxes, you had estate taxes, you had taxes on cars, taxes on alcohol, taxes on gasoline, taxes on cars, all a wide variety of tax laws. So in 1939, all Congress did was just copied all of those laws and stuck them into one book. And then they enacted that book and called it the 1939 Internal Revenue Code. Now, where was the income tax provisions? Well, there were income tax provisions in the 1939 Internal Revenue Code at the first part of the 1939 Internal Revenue Code. Where did that come from? Well, Congress had pulled that from the 1938 Internal Revenue laws. So in 1939, the 1938 Internal Revenue laws were stuck into the 1939 Internal Revenue Code. Well, when you go back and take a look at the 1938 Act, well, suddenly you see, when you take a look at the first couple of sections, gee, the 1938 Act was simply a replacement for the 1936 Income Tax Act. When you go back to the 1936 Income Tax Act, you read the tax imposed section, whoa, it imposed a tax in lieu of the 1934 tax. When you go back to the 1934 tax, well, you'll find that, gee, the 1934 Act was a replacement of the 1932 Act. When you go back to the 1932 Act, you see that that's the replacement for the 1928 Act. The 1928 Act, when you go back to it, was replaced by it replaced the 26 tax. The 26 tax imposed a tax in lieu of the 1924 Act. The 1924 Act imposed a tax in lieu of the 1921 Act. And when you go back to the 1921 Act and start reading it, well, lo and behold, it was nothing more than a replacement of the Revenue Act of 1918. And then when you go back to the 1918 Act, it replaced two taxes, the 1916 and 1917. So here is the way the income tax laws are structured. This is the chronological order for it. And there is a lot to be learned when you examine the income tax from this chronological viewpoint. So let's start off with the 1913 Act. The 1913 Act imposed, let's see, I think we've got it on the screen here. Section 2. Joe, you wrote it. The 1913 income tax. And since this program is going to be devoted to, well, what is income? We're going to take a look at each of these sections that define income. Lo and behold, look at that. In the 1913 Act, in Section 2. Now, when you go back, I think it's real important, you don't have to look and you don't have to understand the old acts. It is very, very beneficial just to examine it and know that you've examined it before and you've seen it. And guess what? If you just take a look for 15 minutes for the 1913 income tax, guess what? That 15 minutes is millions of times more of review than anybody in the IRS. The people that are administering the tax laws, the people who work for the Internal Revenue Service, they do not look at the old stuff. And so when our movement is, at least from me, with what I've just explained to you, how was the income tax built? All this in lieu of. The people inside the Internal Revenue Service, I guarantee you they're lawyers that have absolutely no knowledge of the history. All they know is what is current. And certainly the people that work for the IRS, they never look at the old stuff. All they're taught is if they're going to learn about the income tax, they're just going to study some manuals, what the IRS has to say. And they can't, because they have no exposure to the actual words of the law, they can never have any appreciation of, the nuances, the complexity of this particular law. Now, when you go back to the 1913 Act, let me just tell you, it was divided into two different parts. Before that time, in 1912, what was the primary source of revenue for the federal government? It wasn't the income tax. It was other types of taxes. What Congress and what President Trump is toying with right now. We're beginning to resurrect that form of taxation we had before the income tax. In 1913, the income tax was something completely new. Now, at that time, since there was no income tax being enforced, no income tax resulting in revenue to the federal government, the primary source of revenue for the federal government were these excise taxes. So when you take a look at the 1913 Act, this is something that, the people in the tax movement come along and start talking about. They read some of these old cases and, whoa, what's this excise tax? And they're simply unaware of the fact, and all you have to do is look at the laws. Now, one of the things you have access to in this group, decades ago, I thought it was very, very beneficial for people to have, for me at that time, let's say it's the early 90s. What did I do if I wanted to look at the tax laws? Well, I had to either run to the law library, but I had at that time, I had been to the law library and just sent a lot of dimes through the copying machine, copying all of the tax acts. That way, I wouldn't have to go to the law library. But everybody else had to go to the law library. Now, if you went to the law library and took a look at the 1913 Act, you would understand, well, gee, the first part of the 1913 Act was an excise tax. And it's interesting just to sit down and take a look, read these provisions of these excise tax, tax on booze, tax on, all sorts of things. And there was a free list. Those types of goods and commodities, they could come into the country without the payment of any tax. But the first part of the 1913 Act was the excise tax, and part two was the income tax. And when you sit there and take a look at the income tax in 1913, you find, well, gee, it's incredibly short. But one of the things you will find when you take a look at the 1913 Act, here on the screen, we have income defined. Now, I would suggest to you that Section 2, now this Section 2 gets repeated through the subsequent acts. What is income? Well, it's the gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal services, of whatever kind and whatever form paid. Now, Mark, let me ask you something. Is a gain, is a profit, is an income equal to, or does it mean the same thing as a salary? What does that phrase mean to you, Mark? Gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal services.
Well, first of all, I would ask what derived means.
Well, derived means take a salary and some part. It's not equal to, a salary is not the same thing as a gain, a profit, or income. A gain, profit, or an income is only a part of. It's not the whole of the salary, because the gain, profit, income is derived from. It is some part of a salary. It is some part of a wage. It's some part of a compensation for personal service. Would you agree?
Yeah. Otherwise, it would say income from salaries.
Yes, 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 yes. So, with bearing in mind Section 61, which we were looked at earlier tonight, you know, is Section 61 lacking in certain phrasing that would make it clearer? Or does Section 2 make what is income clearer than Section 61? Mark?
Well, that's what we're questioning, aren't we? Because I kind of put the accent on except as otherwise provided in this subtitle. So I usually like to start my studies with the exceptions before I read 1,000 pages of general definitions. Is there any except as otherwise provided in this subtitle that you could point us at?
Well, let me ask you this. Compensation for services was used previously, right? Compensation.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there it is. Now, go back to Section 61. In this situation, compensation for personal services is not equal to income. Yet here in Section 61, one of the tricks that's been pulled is to make it appear that compensation for services is 100% income. Is that the implication, Mark?
Well, I would certainly read it. If I didn't know better, I would even go as far as saying compensation for services could be wages.
Yeah, yeah, but they're using two different parts of the same section. So, you have a rule of statutory construction. In a statute, each word has its own meaning, separate and distinct from the words surrounding it. So gains, profits, and income, those are all uniquely, separately different, but all of them, that's what the tax falls upon. But they all have this quote character. They fit within the general rubric of income for the 16th Amendment purposes. But then, the stuff that is not included, like gains, profits, and income derived from wages, salaries, and compensation for personal services. Wages, salaries, and compensation for personal services is distinctly different according to the rules of statutory construction from compensation from income. Would you agree?
I would. So what I'm getting from what you're saying, Larry, is that every word is very important and we cannot read beyond its meaning in the context it's applied.
That is true. Okay, let's say you had a law that imposed taxes on certain animals, but not all animals.
Not on
Let's say
me.
that a legislature comes along and passes a $10 tax on animals at farms. And the animals that are taxed are a cow, a pig, a horse, and a chicken. Those are the objects of the tax. They're all different. And so you can't sit there and say, that all animals are taxed by that tax. No, there are only four that are taxed by that tax. And, you can't say, if let's say that chickens had a tax of 10 cents, but a horse had a tax of $10. You couldn't sit there and say, well, I'm going to impose on chickens the tax on horses. The legislature's going to get a lot more money. No, that can't happen because a chicken and a horse, they're two different things. And that's the way the rules of statutory construction, just over the years, over the decades, over the centuries, the courts have had to deal with, how do you interpret sections of a law? So they have developed these various rules for dealing with the meaning of words in a statute. And so, one of the most basic rule is, each word means something different. You don't have um, a law dealing with a tax on horses, cows, pigs, and chickens, and you can't. You got to acknowledge that all those words are different and they refer to different things. And so the same thing happens here with income. So these rules of statutory construction are real important. But what Section 61 does, it just in reference to compensation for services, gross income derived from business. The implication is that compensation for services is income. And yet, just if you go back to when in 1954, in the summer of 1954, Congress was taking a look at the 1939 Internal Revenue Code. Now, here on the screen, even though this is what the 1913 definition of gross income, it was still the same by 1939. We don't need to move, Joe. That's the 1913. But I know from having read it all, this same definition was used throughout all the acts. Now, one of the things that's real important, it's real important to know, I've seen too many patriots, when they dig into the issue of income, they'll read some brief and they'll read some case and, whoever's writing this brief is kind of tearing apart, what income means from what the Supreme Court has said. But, what most people have done because they didn't have access to the old tax acts. Too many patriots, including lawyers, they'll look at just the case law when, what's more important than case law are the words of a statute. And that's especially important in reference to the income tax. So you can plainly see, here on the right side of the screen, we got the 39 code. And when you take a look at the left side of the screen with the 1916 Act, you can see that there's, you can take a look at the definition of income in the old tax acts and see that salaries, wages, and compensation for personal services was different from income. And gains, profits, and income arose from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal services. That's real important. Now let's go on down. Let's go on down to 1916, 1917. In 1916, in 1913, the income tax was imposed. And in 1913, October 1913, Congress passed the 1913 income tax. Boom. Lawsuits were filed. The Bluesaver case was one of them. That went to the United States Supreme Court. And after the Supreme Court affirmed, or they didn't say the 1913 Act was unconstitutional. Typically in a situation like that, let me give an example. I think it was 1909, Congress passed a tax on foreign-built yachts, and the constitutionality was challenged. And it went to the Supreme Court said, yeah, Congress can tax foreign-built yachts. Very, very important, this issue of foreign. Well, after the Supreme Court affirmed that the constitutionality of the tax on foreign-built yachts, guess what Congress did? Congress came along and said, well, in lieu of that 1909 tax, we hereby impose this tax. Now, this is a trick. I maintain it's a trick, but others will say, no, it's not. But the way the tax laws at the federal level have been built is too often, Congress makes sure, gee, this tax is constitutional. Then after the Supreme Court says it's not constitutional, Congress will come along and say, well, in lieu of the existing tax, we impose this tax. So in reference to the very act that was challenged, it remains in effect as the tax imposed section. And all Congress will do after that is amend, that act, and then amend the act that amended that act, and go on, keep on amending. That is the typical route. However, in reference to the income tax, no, that didn't happen. Guess what? Something happened as a result of the Bruce case. And instead, Congress came along, and this is, I've seen this through the tax movement. People will say, well, the 1913 Act was still in effect. No, it's not. If people would simply if you look at my tax CD that contains all the old tax acts and all the regulations, and they are in PDFs, and they have been text converted, and guess what? You can engage in word searches. So I think it's real important for, if you're dealing with any federal tax, you need to know the history behind it. So here in reference to the income tax, Congress departed from its usual routine. If they felt real good about the tax imposed in the 1913 Act, they would have said in 1916, well, we hereby amend the 1913 Act to impose this tax. No, in 1913 they said, we are repealing the 1913 Act. Now, when you take a look at, when you take a look at the provisions of the 1913 Act, and then take a look at the new provisions in the 1916 Act, you can see some substantial differences. And, I think last week we may have covered that. We said, what was it, Section 24, Section 25? There were differences, and people didn't realize that. So looking at Section 24 and 25, Section 24 was on one page down toward the bottom, and Section 25 was on the next page at the top of the page of the Section 25 of the 1916 Act. And you need to take a look at those. And a lot of people haven't looked at that. And boy, there's some hidden implications, hidden meaning in that section. But moving on, it's real important for people to understand, the 1916 Act was imposed. It was amended in 1917. And then in 1919, by means of the Revenue Act of 1918, they proposed it in 1918. They didn't enact it in 1918, so they adopted it in 1919, but they kept the same name, the Revenue Act of 1918. Only Congress can do something like that. Normal Americans wouldn't do something like that, but Congress does. But one of the things that's real important is to understand, that this phrase to describe the object of the tax, let's go down, Joe, let's go down to the 1918 Act. Section
While
3.
you're looking for that, Joe, real quick, two people entered the waiting room. When you have a chance, let them in.
Okay, so now we have in 1918, we have Section A, 213A, includes gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal services. That's all we need to talk about. If you want to study, you can study the rest of it. But for purposes of tonight, we're only going to deal with this issue here. So here you have gains, profits, and income derived from, oh wait, a salary, a wage, a compensation for personal service. Looks like if they include gains, profits, or income, it's not the entirety of the salary, wage, or compensation for personal service. Would you agree with that, Mark?
Most definitely. I am a stickler to words. Derived didn't make sense to me. If income means salaries, wages, or compensation for personal services, right from.
And a salary isn't equal to, it's not the exact same thing as a gain or profit or income, right?
Right.
Now, here's a point I want to make, and this is something that's real important. And then, we've only got maybe about 15 minutes and a few minutes, and I would like to take at least spend 10 minutes of this program. I would like to ask some of our attendees to chime in and tell us what they would like to learn during the course of these weekly weekend meetings. But here's the point I want to make before we conclude tonight. Section 213. Gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensated for personal services. Let's go down to 1921. Guess what? It says the same thing. Gross income includes gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal services. Let's go down to the 24. Section 213. The term gross income includes gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal service. Let's go down to the next one, 26. She still says the same thing. The term gross income includes the gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, or compensated for personal services. Okay, let's go down to the next one, 28. Still says the same blooming thing. General definition. Gross income includes gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensation for personal services. Dang! Hey, Gary, has it changed? Mark?
Oh,
Have we seen anything? Am I reading the same thing all the time?
I looks like the same to me.
Okay. Well, maybe it changes a little later. 1932, Section 22. General definition. Gross income includes gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, and compensated for personal services. 34. Dang! 34 reads the same way. Wow! In 1936, it still reads the same thing.
Just a
1930.
separate and a different section, right? That's the difference.
Yeah. I mean, it's a different act, but they all follow the same pattern. Section 22, like Section 22 and all these acts dealt with gross income. Section 143 dealt with withholding of tax from non-resident aliens and foreign corporations. They were all basically the same. Let's go down to the 39 code. Now, here's what happened in 1939. There were a couple of sections from the 1938 Act that were not stuck into the 39 code. But Section 22 is one of them, dealing with gross income. Gross income includes gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, compensated for personal services. Now, let me just tell you, this is something that decades ago, I just kind of got irate because at that time I'd been through this stuff. But we had a bunch of people, pro se's, they were hot under the collar. Whoa, wages are not income. And one of the things, that the people back in those days, the pro se's, they're making the argument about wages are not income. Uh, because they had ignored the history. All they were looking at, and this is, a common habit. You're going to you're just going to isolate the arguments that you make just based on what the courts have had to say. Well, courts have, make their decisions. Each case is different, and usually the statutes are a little bit different. But lo and behold, there is this nasty habit of, just always build your arguments based on what the courts have had to say, to the exclusion of statutes. Now, I can remember, encountering these people that were making the argument, well, wages are not income. And, all they did was roll on Section 61 and just, tell a judge, well, wages are not income. One of the things that they ignored, what I've been talking about during the course of this program, the history. Now, I don't know about you. When the income tax acts were created in 1916, they went up to the Supreme Court again. And there was a number of Supreme Court cases dealing with this issue of income. Now, this is I'm going to use a Greek term here. This definition in Section 22 of gross income is a damn good definition. At least it's better than Section 61. Now, in reference to the people that are making the argument, well, wages are not income, they ignored this history. Now, if you would have incorporated into your arguments, this historical development, Section 61, in my view, is equal to Section 61. And to me, here you have salaries, wages, and compensation for personal services. Lo and behold, they are somewhat different from gains, profits, and income. I would like to know if we got anybody that kind of disagrees with that. Well, hearing none, I say that everybody can plainly see, gee, looking back at this old stuff, and remember, this Section 22 definition is equal to the definition of income in Section 61. They both mean the same thing. But under Section 22, under the 39 code and prior, hey, there's a difference, because a salary and a wage and a compensation for personal service, some segment or somehow, some way, those items produce income, but they are not income. There is some difference between them. So that is what could be learned by looking at the historical development. And I'll tell you this, because the people that were making the argument about wages and not income, they surrendered. They were completely unaware of a part of their argument that was greatly strengthened it. So that's the point I want to make tonight. Now, Mark has a memo that I produced called The Character of Income. Now, I think that the people that are interested in this issue need to get from Mark. There it is on the screen. It's how many pages? Doesn't say how many pages here. 6 or 7 pages.
6.
But I think, and a lot of this is over on my website. I would think this one is I haven't compared it, but I would say this brief has a lot more than what's posted on the website. But I think for those that are interested in this, having studying points like this educates you about unique features of the income tax laws. And the United States Supreme Court, that people use today, what the Supreme Court said about income was based upon what these first definitions of income contained in the 1916, 1918, 1921, 24, 26, 28, 32, 34, 36, 38, 39 code. Section 22, and the Supreme Court was looking at Section 22 when these decisions were made about what is income. So we have all these people who are making references to Supreme Court decisions dealing with income, and they don't comprehend, they don't understand, they need to, that what was the statutory definition back in those days? Well, it was found in Section 22. So hey, do we have any? God, we got about 7 minutes left, I guess, if we're going to just stop at 1 hour. But I would like to throw it out to our attendees. I would like to hear from them what they would like to for us to cover. What they would like to know about. So, can we do that,
Before,
John?
yeah, we can. Before we do that, though, there's a point of clarity that's required.
All right.
They're a little bit unclear of what the point is behind the importance of derived. So, are they to equate derived with income?
No, I would say, if you look at the dictionary definition of derive, something that is derived from something is a part of what it was derived from, but they're not equal. To me, that's that's the meaning of the word derived. And, I think most people would agree. Here we have Nelda from Maryland saying that derived is a subset. That's correct. So,
Could we get like an example? What would be derived from wages that would constitute
income,
income? Right.
income is derived from wages.
So
That's what the
what's
statute says.
how does it happen? What's the process? In other words, if I make the income based on my labor, I'm not deriving income from my labor. Maybe someone else is deriving income from my labor.
Well, how about Larry, the like a vacation pay or the fringe benefits? I think people would understand if you gave them an example like that.
Yeah. And this is the reason why, you know, if you go back to, I like to dig into when the 54 Code was enacted, and then the Bureau of Internal Revenue and Internal Revenue Service. Hey, y'all got to remember in the early 50s, the collection agent was the Bureau of Internal Revenue. How did we get to the Internal Revenue Service? Well, there was a big corruption scandal in the Bureau of Internal Revenue, and it was so nasty that Congress had to change the name of the Bureau of Internal Revenue to Internal Revenue Service. Now, that's just an aside. Derived from is a segment of whatever whatever you're deriving something from, whatever's derived is a part of that, but not equal to the whole thing. And there's a set of books that lawyers use. It's called Words and Phrases. You go to a law library, and it collects all these words, all the definite cases that have defined words. And they'll provide to you, well, this case, this case, this case, this case. They provide quotes from the cases. They put it all in one spot. The cases. Hey, if you want to find out income, go to the law library, pull out words and phrases. But today, it's everything on the computer. But if you do consult words and phrases, you can pull up, just turn to the section in this. It's a giant dictionary. And I forgot how many volumes it might be, 10 or 12, but it's a lot of volumes. And all these cases have determined what words are. They collect put it all into one spot. Well, income. So you can turn to the part in words and phrases, income, and find the cases and quotes. So it's very handy if you want to quickly find out what a word means legally, what the courts have had to say, you use words and phrases. So does that answer the question? I don't know.
Well, we're talking about income. I guess the question was about the term or word derived. That implies an action on the side of the actual wage. So it's not,
Yeah, but whatever is derived from something else
that's
is
correct. So,
not equal to, it's not the exact same thing. It's only a part.
so what would that be? Tip?
Well, you know what?
Wasn't there a case, Larry, where they like a state trooper or something where he had the
Yeah, but about something about meal allowance or
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Just tell him about that, or do the best I can with my memory.
Well, I'll give you this idea. I've dug into, when the 54 code came out in August, it was enacted by Congress in August of 54. And it has sections that say it authorizes the Commissioner of Electoral Revenue to promulgate regulations for the enforcement of the provisions of the 54 code. Now, one of the things that, uh, I've dug into things like income. Let's say about 55, 1956, 1957, after the 54 code has been enacted and the commissioner is coming along and, it wants to implement some regulations to clean up and provide his meaning to various sections of the Internal Revenue Code. And boy, I was just really impressed. You know, I found it kind of suspicious, that, like what a salary is. And, if you sit there and see how the commissioner, and maybe I'll try to dig it out. It's kind of late. It's 6:59 right now. But I'll try to remember the next week and I'll dig out um, some of these early, 50, 56, 57. And some of these really odd. I mean, it's just really, the commissioner almost convinced me. Boy, when he's dealing with what income is, he's got a real good handle on. You know, uh, I will dig out. Let me make a note, and I'll provide an example next week when the old commissioner is trying to, you know, tell us what income means. When I was sitting there reading what he was saying about what income is wow, I think this guy's got a real good handle on it. And he wasn't talking about the pay that you get for working. And in fact, I just was a little befuddled. I don't really contend or oppose the commissioner's idea that wages include, an employer provided car. Boy, an employer provided car is a benefit. It's a perk. Perks provided by the employer. Oh boy, for taxpayers, that is income. And I was just, why in the world for employer provided cars does the commissioner devote 35 pages of regulations? Isn't that kind of odd? But then, employer provided, hey, look, if you get by your employer sick pay, sick pay, sick pay is a wage. And you don't surrender any labor for sick pay. You're not working at all. You're at home in bed, arguably. And you're not surrendering any labor, but your employer has agreed to give you compensation. Boy, if that isn't a benefit to be called a wage, I don't know what is. Just like an employer provided car. The employer gives you a car to use. You don't pay a blooming thing, but he wants to keep you in his good graces. So he provides you a Rolls Royce or a VW. That's a perk. And gee, are perks called wages? That's very, and I was just kind of flabbergasted, in the mid 50s when you take a look at some of these Section 61 regulations, which are still there. And, I just find it kind of odd, you know, is a wage really a perk? A perk? You don't surrender any, that's a benefit. You get this benefit because of your employer's providing it. It can arguably fall within the category of a wage, but you're not surrendering any labor. So how in the world can you sit there and say for your vacation pay, your employer gives you 2 weeks of vacation pay? You don't surrender any labor for that's a perk. But is it wages? That's what the
But is it
calls
federal? But is it federal nexus of any kind? I don't care. Is it any federal? What I mean, where would federal jurisdiction reach that employer giving as many
Hey,
perks?
listen here, Mr. Lucas.
Thank you, sir.
A non-citizen has a privilege in this country.
No.
Surprise, surprise.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Oh, Claire. Figure she'd do that. Well, hey, it's now 7:03 my time. So how much longer are we going to go on? I'll go on for a few more minutes. If the fans, if our attendees want to carry on some more, but hey, we still haven't. I want to know what the people that are attending these meetings would like to learn.
Well, they
Well,
want to learn one quick answer. Hopefully, they not have to wait until next week. They want to know today who is required to pay income taxes. Can you answer that today?
No, I'm not going to answer that because that's a problem I've dealt with for decades. And people who just have the answer told to them, those are the worst defenders of any position. They cannot defend it. So you have to know something. And just having something told to you, oh, I've had too many people in the I call them participants in the tax movement. Oh, just tell me the answer. I don't want to have to do all this. And then those are the weakest people. And when the slightest bit of pressure comes on, I was just looking for somebody to tell me the answer. I don't want to have to study all this stuff. So I've learned decades ago that just simply telling people an answer, they're just want the easy way out, and the people that want an easy way out are the least helpful people for defending a position. That's my
I think the reason I hear you, and I think the reason they're asking this question is because some other people offer a short sentence about this. For example, Dave Champion says the non-resident aliens and foreign corporations, and also Americans
residing abroad.
outside the country, right, abroad, within countries with tax treaties, etc.
Well, yeah,
So
and as soon as you tell people that, and that's all they know, I don't care. I'm not going to contribute to this movement. I'm not. You're not going to find me at all around this movement. I know the list. Well, I know I have a federal list of who's required to file returns, but you don't running around tell people that because the people you tell are the least prepared. And frankly, I just people that just want the answer, they are not helpful to the movement. I think we got a real problem in this country with the application of the income tax laws. I think we got a real problem with the federal government. We just got we got a system that benefits from free money that they just created out of nothing. Just like Ilhan Omar and all those folks. What, 4 or 5 years ago she had she had a $30,000 debt, and now she's got what, 30 million. And who we had this Texas congressman this week. I kind of thought he was a kind of a good guy. The guy with a patch or his eye. What was his name?
Crenshaw.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And here of late, I thought he was one of the good guys. And of late, I've heard just he's just been milking the system. And having access to the legal tender, corrupts congressmen. And I think we're dealing with corruption by the congressman. And yeah, part of the income tax is to support the paper money system. But we got to get down to rebuilding a country, and we got to have people that are willing to put a shoulder to the wheel.
I agree with Larry. I mean, having been through the gauntlet myself, you know, if you're ever confronted or attacked, and you just say, well, some guy on a radio show told me, I ain't gonna
Yeah.
cut it. So why give that fresh meat that isn't going to benefit, or at least to our best judgment?
And then when those people get into trouble, I'm just gonna throw this. I have seen too many people. Well, I'm in the tax movement. I know these arguments, and then when they get into trouble, they pro se just throw trash.
Yeah, I
And
mean, it's as some maybe more than others, but I think most of the people in the audience realize that this is a stacked deck. It's a very it's a controlled environment. It's like the old Colosseums where they'd bring you in, the gladiators or just the Christians and feed you the lions. I mean, it's a real controlled arena out there, a stacked deck. And so we don't want to just put out easy peasy stuff that is really, in our view, harmful to people. And so apologize if people don't, wanted some quick ABC, silver bullet, but that's not what we're giving out. And believe me, I tell people all the time, if I had a silver bullet, I'd be giving them out, maybe for cost or free. I mean, I only have so much of my own resources, but wouldn't be charging for it. Or just, hey, this is what it costs me. But other than that, we don't want to give you something that's a paper tiger, and just telling you something without you figuring it out for yourself is of no value as far as we're concerned.
Yeah, it's no value to me, and I will never do it. I learned decades ago, just telling people, hey, just tell me, just tell me, just tell me. And those are the most dangerous people to have around. And when they approach me, I walk off.
Mark,
if you're not willing to learn, then you need to be involved in the freedom movement.
Well, they're not ill-willing, and I think that everybody participating in groups like these, they're already way above the crowds. Okay, at least they
yeah, but
interest.
I mean, there's a bunch of crap that floats around in the freedom movement.
That's true, and they're searching, and they don't realize what they don't know, that they don't know what they don't know. So it's a learning process, and it takes this repetition stuff, and that's why we're doing this, for their sake. And just before I forget to mention, looks like Claire has a hand up, and Tapster tried to have his hand up, but he didn't know how to do it. So
he was clapping.
Oh, he was clapping?
Yeah, that's Tapster.
Well, let me get Claire unmuted. Let's give it a try. Thanks for waiting, Claire. You're on.
Well, I think that we make it too hard. I think we ought to spend more time on jurisdiction. The Congressional Research Service said that the money is not the object of the tax. The money is the measurement of the tax. And if it's an excise tax, it has to have a federal nexus. So the way that you would have money derived to be income would be if I earn my money at the Arizona Senate and I even get paid for sick days, and I take that money and I invest it in Amtrak, that is a federal corporation, and I sell it for a profit. After I fill out the 1040 to take any deductions that I might be available to me, there might be some income that I would owe as a return of income to the federal government for them being so nice for having Amtrak for me to invest in. If an alien comes here to work or invest without coming here, that's a privilege. And if they earn money because the federal government had something to do with it, if they have a profit after taking their deductions, then the government might have a claim for return of income. But if there's no profit or gain after the deductions, there's still no claim whether it was an excise tax that was taxable income or not.
How about a foreigner mowing my lawn?
That's in the private, that has nothing to do with it. That's money that has no federal jurisdiction. If you have somebody from the federal government come and mow your lawn, that might be a different story. But that's why I think we need to learn more about jurisdiction before trying to put a square peg into a round hole, because all this income stuff, I can tell you what I've learned from Tommy Cryer's memorandum and Peter Gibbons and Dick Stein and everybody else, that if it's not federal, it doesn't apply to you. And there's not one syllable in Title 26 anywhere that applies to me in Arizona. And that's what that $100,000 reward is for from Truth Attack. If you can find the statute of liability that makes me liable working in Arizona, then great. I'll take the referral fee when you get the 100 grand, but I can tell you it's not there.
So I'm sure you probably know, but you forgot to mention that all those people that you mentioned before, all their knowledge comes from
Study.
Larry's research.
Absolutely. And that's where I learned about jurisdiction. There's a lot of great stories about jurisdiction on Larry's website about jurisdiction. And that's where we need to start. Because if it's not federal and the federal government didn't have me have anything to do with the way I make my money, it has no claim. I don't care how I made my money. If the federal government had nothing to do with it, it has no claim. And that's why Tommy won his case. That was his whole memorandum.
Well, that was Larry, that was his attorney.
And that's exactly right. So I don't
Okay.
know why we don't have to get into what are wages. Well, when you read the Internal Revenue Code, wages only applies to people working for the federal government. You can't find anybody in the private sector in the whole Title 26. It's nowhere. It's all a federal benefit of some sort. If you get a copyright or a patent and you make money on that, then you have maybe a return of income to the federal government. But if you self-publish your book in Arizona and make money on it, you don't owe the feds any money. They had no claim.
So it's your contention that a non-resident alien operating in the private sector in the United States of America would not be touched by the federal government.
No, because they're a non-resident alien. I'm talking about American citizens. We're Americans and we don't owe money to the Fed. If we want something to the Fed, we go to them. If they give us a benefit or a privilege, maybe we give them a cut if we have a profit, but otherwise we don't. They don't come to us. And in 72 it says they don't come to us without a specific job to do. The IRS should never be in our states.
So
It
let me
has
repeat the
nothing to do
question.
with us.
A foreigner making money from within the country while competing
A
with businesses
foreigner
within
gets a
the country.
privilege for being here. Of course, they owe
That,
an income. I'm
so
talking
that's
about
a private
Americans who were
but
born
that
here.
we agree. So, but you mentioned the word private business. So he could have a private business conducting private business with a private business within the United States of America.
But if he's not a citizen, it's a benefit to be doing that.
Well, thank you.
That's right. But
Okay,
for
so that's
me,
what brings them under the federal
and I
jurisdiction.
want to tell you, when the IRS and the government attacked me, they never mentioned the time that I worked for the Arizona Senate. And I was an attaché there, and that's actually where I met Larry when he came for the Conference for the West 2-day symposium that we had about the EPA land grab. And that was way back in the 80s, and the IRS never mentioned a single thing about Arizona, and they reported me all the way. And the other thing is, if you don't want to be involved in any of this, don't sign any papers that don't pertain to you, because if there's no reporting, there's no problem. It's the reporting that starts the whole chain. So if you sign a W-9 or a W-4 or a W-2, then good luck to you, because you're saying that you're somebody that you're not. If you're an American, it doesn't apply to you, and it's your guy you're working for's fault, who's not an employer, because that's a federal definition. It's his fault for using a federal form on you, and you should not get a job with that guy if he's going to do that. Now, one of my friends does a lot of work for as an independent on big giant computers that use these huge floppy disks for their whole company, and he has them pay him as a vendor, and they don't send a W-9 or report on the guy that repairs their copy machine or the people that clean their offices at night or any of those, because they're vendors, and that's how he works for them, as a vendor. So that's an idea for people that don't want to be sucked into this. But I'm telling you, it's these forms that you do with your employer that gets the whole ball rolling. And if you don't do that, you have no problemo. You could live in the White House and make $1 billion, and without signing these forms, you'll never be touched. You would
That's
have
what we're
no
working.
income.
That's what we're working on, figuring out a way for us to get this solved.
And
And
jurisdiction is the way to start.
we agree. We agree. Let's see what Tapster has to say, Joe, right?
Sure.
He's got his hand up.
Yeah, and then we gotta wrap it up. Go ahead,
All right,
Tapster.
I unmuted myself.
Thanks, Claire.
All I was gonna say was, for those that were looking for the magic bullet, I guarantee you what you just heard from Claire did not come by magic bullet, but it came from multiple years of study. Larry has provided a resource that gives you access. Whether you want to open the door or not is up to you. But it is critical if you want to understand this. I mean, what Claire did was a beautiful summation of crap that I've learned and read about for 25 years. I'm not as articulate, but the other thing, the reason I raised my hand the first time was when Joe said, you can't tell somebody you heard this on the radio and think it's going to stick. My question was, well, Joe, isn't that how you got here?
Well, but I heard it on the radio, and then I studied for 2 years while I still worked at the IRS.
I know the story. I know the
you're
story.
right.
I just got tickled.
I've been studying for just over, let's see, I resigned on my birthday, February 25th, 1999. So it's been 27 years.
Yep.
Plus the 2 in the IRS. So yes, you're right, Tapster. The radio is where I first heard about it.
Well, you said gay. I heard some guy, and then I said, "Well, I could say it was Debbie, but anyway, I just got tickled when I heard that. I said, "Well, hell, that's how he got here."
Yeah.
But for those of you that are new, because a lot of people in the chat were saying, "What's the magic bullet?" And I see when you go through people that have not put the time and effort into it, they want a quick answer. That's one of the reasons Larry is saying that back in the 80s, when this started, if it had been done right in the 80s, we wouldn't be here today. The problem is it wasn't, and people were just saying, hey, my income's not wages or whatever the argument was, without the full story and the history. The history is critical. Somehow that's got, if we don't get this resolved, our kids are screwed. And I've said that for 25 years. And but anyway, I'll mute myself, Joe, because I know y'all got to cut it loose. But Claire, beautiful summation, and thank you for it, because it was really good.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Yeah, we this is a record. We had like 30 people plus Larry, Mark, and I. So that's a record. Usually it was hovering around 20 to 25. So I
Does
don't know,
that mean Saturdays are better than
something
Friday?
about Saturdays after, some people seem to like it. I don't know. I'll have to talk to the family.
Hey, maybe we ought to try some more Fridays, some more Saturdays.
Okay, well, we'll see. We'll see. Usually I'm
Hey,
working
for
my butt
those that,
off on.
if you want to make a comment, send it to us. Let us know what day you prefer.
Yeah. So
Hey,
you can
Saturdays.
let's
When it's
do
no longer football season, Saturdays are great.
some housekeeping. So maybe Mark, why don't you just quickly tell everybody about your Telegram resource?
Well, as a consequence of a proponent of non-resident filing by the name of David William, who has not been heard from in the past 3 months, I opened up a channel for the people that were his clients. And we're almost close to 50 people now. And it's called No Mas Tax Chat on Telegram. No Mas Tax is capital N-O, capital M-A-S, capital T-A-X, all one word, and chat with a capital C. No Mas Tax Chat. I can send a link if you want. We can put that in the link. So it's an open discussion forum, and we share everything that we discuss here on this channel and all the teachings from Larry. And also we analyze what has been promoted by other people in the tax honesty movement. And we're pretty open about it. And people share their own experiences. And I think it's a good forum to be in. What we're trying to do, I'm trying to build a forum of at least 1,000 people so that we can, at some point, donate a couple $100 to a law group formed through Larry and other attorneys in the movement that are in the know, and finance some lawsuits that would actually be very effective into solving all these problems and all these questions that we have in these little meetings here, because it's been my experience for the past 26 years that it's very hard to reach conclusive evidence from them, from IRS or state agencies, that you have prevailed in becoming a non-taxpayer. Administratively seems almost an impossible task, because they will change the rules overnight. They will change something, or they'll put it in, on a back burner for 2, 3, 4 years, and then you get slapped with some kind of a penalties. You didn't file, you didn't do this, didn't do that. So you never know where you stand with them. So the alternative is to take this to court, have some major, very well placed strategic lawsuits that will force the courts to admit some of the key issues that create this, was addressed by Claire, the first point of entry, which is the contention between employee and employer. It's the employer's fault for being ignorant and compelling the employees to sign those forms that would eventually be the entry of presumption for the IRS or state agencies to consider you a taxpayer. That's the gist of it. So if you like to talk and bring your own discussion in your cases, we have far more time on those Telegram calls. We try to do every couple months. We try to do a conference call for people that can open their own issues, and that's about it. That's all there is. It's no promoting beyond that. I'm trying to build it to at least 1,000 people, so that we can all make it very affordable to finance the litigation efforts that would be run by Joe, Larry, and other few people, good people behind the good attorneys in this country.
Fantastic. All right, well then let's just go through the websites, mostly for people that'll watch this in an archive. Go to search engine, type in Beecraft Briefs. That'll take you to this link. And Larry's website called the Dixieland Law Journal. I think Larry said you can search Dixieland Law Journal and you'll come up to it also. As we've shown, lots of great stuff here. My website is agentfortruth.com. I've got an X account at Joseph Bannister. You can check that out. I think that's about it. Oh, I do like showing people that if you go to my blog articles here and my website, well, I encourage people to look at this 1040A scam. I think you won't enjoy it because you're going to find out how the IRS scams their own computers to cheat people and steal people's money. But anyway, check that out and spread it around. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for spending some of their Saturday with us. And grateful. God bless you. Have a great weekend.